Hello and welcome to another episode of I Remember the Inland Empire. I'm Chuck Street. I'm going to be the host for today's program, and we are going to focus on the life of Evelyn Pinky Brier, who was truly an iconic person in the Inland Empire. She was a pioneering pilot, an entrepreneur, and many, many other things. She was really an extraordinary person and definitely part of the fabric and the history of the Inland Empire. Joining us today is Bill Lemon, who was her friend and also her personal attorney. And he has overseen a book that's been pretty much finished. It's in draft form now, and I had a chance to review it in the last week or so. And it really does a great job of spotlighting a very, very interesting life with an amazing woman. So, Bill, welcome to our program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to talk about Pinky.
You know, if I could, I'd like to read something that was part of the preface of the book draft. And it sums up, from 50,000 feet, what Pinky was all about. So what you say here is that Pinky Brier was America's first female flight instructor and much more. She was also the driving force behind San Bernardino's Tri-City Airport for more than 40 years. Pinky was the first certified female aerobatics instructor, the only woman to teach Army Air Force pilots aerobatics during World War II, the first woman airmail pilot, the first woman invited to join the WASP, and that was a group of lady pilots who used to ferry aircraft across the country. And then the go-to charter pilot for movie stars, politicians, mobsters, and then you put in here the G-men who were chasing them. So, Bill, can you tell us a little more about Pinky's personality? I think she was bigger than life, and I know that you're going to have a lot to say about her personality.
Well, she was bigger than life in many respects, but she was actually a small woman. She was rather petite, which made her accomplishments even more successful in what, as we said earlier, was very much a man's world in her day and age. Pinky had two sides to her. One, she'd have that pink flight suit that she would wear and wore all day long. And then she had a great interest, even up into her 90s, of driving down to Eamon Wardy and Neiman Marcus and these various places at Fashion Island to buy the latest in designer clothes. And so she had a huge, huge wardrobe in her upstairs at her house. And at the time came to sort of clean it out. We had several pink jumpsuits, but we had many, many designer items that still have the tags on them that she had never worn. So she had those two sides. So she could be fiery as hell and let you have it, and then she could dress to the nines and go out and enjoy time on the town. She, as you said, Chuck, she has this huge record of flying because she ferried first class mail to LAX 4 times a day. And that was just the mail. Then she ferried people to LAX to catch their airlines. The kind of personality she was fiery, elegant. She could use words with the best of them, but she could walk with queens as well. She had a sister who was very famous, Jean Dixon. And Jean Dixon in her day was in over 800 newspapers. And she was famous for writing the predicting the death of President Kennedy, and she was a soothsayer to Nancy Reagan and to Francisco Franco, the president of Spain. So Pinky had this great competition and had a brother that was an All-American, another brother that was a dentist, and so very competitive Pinkert family. The name Pinky came from Pinkert, which was her maiden name, and her sister lived in Washington, married to a very prominent Georgetown lawyer, very prominent in the country with prominent clients. And Pinky would go visit her periodically and stay at what was a famous old Washington hotel called the Mayflower. And Pinky would check in at the Mayflower and walk around to all of the staff on the first floor, the doorman, the bellman, the front desk. And we're talking about 1970s, right? Hand them all $100 bill on the first day that she got there. So
Wow.
they would know Pinky Brier was there. And when her sister would come to pick her up to take her to some swanky event in Washington, it was, yes, Miss Brier, yes, Miss Brier, yes, Miss Brier, and not, oh, good to see you, Miss Dixon. Nice to see you. Have you here, Miss Dixon, which I think was part of the sisterly competition. It was part of the personality, but it kind of sets the stage when you ask what kind of an individual was she. She probably was a little bit like Teddy Roosevelt, whom they said when he went to the wedding he wanted to be the bride, and he went to the funeral he wanted to be the corpse. I think that Pinky had a little bit of that in her personality.
You talked about her wardrobe, and I read a passage in a book that you said that she had a shoe collection that would rival that of Imelda Marcos, who was
Right.
famous for having 2,000 pairs of shoes.
And not worn. It wasn't just that she had them. And quite frankly, toward the end of her life, we actually imposed a conservatorship on her. And it's not because she was financially responsible or couldn't do things, but at some stage, the salespeople down at Fashion Island would pack this stuff up, UPS, and just send it to her. And it got to be these packages were coming every day, and she couldn't wear all this. A lot of it got returned, but much of it didn't, which is why there was quite so much in her closets that still had the original tags on them.
Well, let's talk more about her background. She was born in Wisconsin, and she was one of 10 children,
Right.
One of the younger kids. And the family moved, I think, shortly after her birth to Missouri, and then bought a dairy farm. And the entire family worked in the dairy farm. And I think after a few years, her father got the idea that this was way too much work for the amount of money that he was making.
Right.
He didn't particularly like the cold winters in the Midwest or the humidity in the summer. So he relocated the family to California, Santa Clara first, and then down to San Bernardino. And then they proceeded to start some businesses on Mount Vernon Avenue in San Bernardino, which was part of Route 66. I think the first business was a grocery store, and then short down the street was a tire repair shop and gas station. And so Pinky really came from a family that was very entrepreneurial, correct?
No question, and a family that encouraged the children to accomplish, including the women. I mean, the two girls in the family become iconic figures in American history. So, yes, they have a great deal of ambition in the family. As a young person, I never had a chance to meet Miss Dixon, but her brother was a city councilman, Kurt, and we were young. We used to go to Kurt had a house in Newport Beach that he would let the local people use in the summertime, and then she had a brother that was all-American at USC, and then the two girls. So very entrepreneurial, and I think very competitive, obviously, in their lives. So and then for Pinky to really get out there and buy all that acreage between Waterman and Tippecanoe as a relatively young woman who had worked for the Southern California Gas Company, Semper, maybe they call it, and a husband that was a mechanic. You just don't see that every day of the week.
Yeah, that's for sure. Now, she became fascinated with flying really as a toddler almost. And I thought it was interesting in your book, you pointed out how Pinky was born 6 years after the first flight that the Wright brothers successfully had happened at Kitty Hawk.
Right.
So she lived through the era of course, Amelia Earhart, Charles Lindbergh, and Pancho Barnes, many other noteworthy aviators, but it was something that got into her psyche at a very young age.
And never got out of her psyche. And she tried to impress young people. We had a very a well-known criminal lawyer around here named Mr. Castle. He was a great friend of hers. His son still practiced law around here. And Phil Castle would go to her airport, and he just died this past year in his 90s, I believe, a year or two ago in his 90s. So he was quite a bit younger. Pinky would be 110, so he was 20 years younger. So as a teenager, he would go to her field, and she would take young people up almost as a daredevil ride, because she liked to entertain. And she, clearly she was a great pilot, because a lot of people try to do stunts in aircraft, and as you know, Chuck, it doesn't go quite like they expect. But she loved to take young people up, and his enthusiasm, and then she tried to pass it on to others. And even her husband Joe, I don't know that he was much of a pilot, but he was her mechanic for years. And I don't think that she would have really been as successful with her small airline and with her successful airplanes had she not had someone that was devoted to she and to their craft of the mechanics. So she had that enthusiasm. She had the enthusiasm in her husband Joe, and carried on to. She still talked about it. She lived to be in her late 90s, and didn't talk so much the last year or so. But she had a deal she would do with her fingers to roll them around to make them like they were a propeller, and just she would light up talking about being in the skies. And there's such a thing as what is known in the medical business as a Hoyer lift. As you get older and you can't maneuver so much, what you use, but it was like she was flying. And so in her last days, when the Hoyer lift was using to help care for her, she loved being on it because she was up in the air again.
Well, I copied down a passage from the book draft that you provided to me about her husband, Joe Brier, who was born in the Midwest in 1905. And apparently from the time he earned his wings in 1929 as a 24-year-old Army Air Force pilot, it seems fate prepared him to fly into Pinky's arms. From the first day they crossed paths, both of them knew it. And then you said, maybe or maybe not. But she was obviously very devoted to him. And I know that as World War II broke out, she was asked to join a new aviation group of women called the Wasps.
Right.
And then she sort of postponed that because she was waiting for her husband to be called up, and he eventually was, and he ended up, I guess, in Burma or something like that.
Right, Burma, yeah.
So then she accepted the invitation to be a WASP pilot. And tell us what you know about the Wasps.
Well, it was a group of women that were teaching women and teaching men. I think these were days actually before the Air Force was created. So all I know is what I've read in history, but I know that she gloated about being one of those people that was there. I think we have some pictures in the book of the WASP, and it kind of set the stage for her being a tough woman and being able to run an airport and an airline, I think, in later years.
And work with men.
And well, that was the whole point. Yeah. She was always going to survive in her working with men.
She could hold her own, that's for sure, right?
Beyond that.
Yeah, and so they loved her. I guess in the Midwest they would call what she had was moxie. She
Right.
had moxie, and
Right.
and so I think that the men respected her because of her flying abilities and her moxie.
She had, I told you, she had these airlines. So she had Pinky 1, Pinky 2, Pinky 3, and Pinky 4. And I've had many old time pilots say that when Pinky 1 was in the air and she was crossing over to land at LAX, or Pinky 2 was landing in Las Vegas, everybody clear the way because Pinky's coming and we're not going to cause any trouble and have any confrontation. So Pinky 1, 2, 3, and 4 were magical names in modern call signs. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's funny. So the WASP, because the men were overseas, and at that time they would not allow women to be pilots and fight in combat.
Right.
So there were as many men as they could train. They were being trained and sent overseas to fight the war in the Pacific and also in Europe. So there was a shortage of pilots. So she and the other WASP were tasked with ferrying large bombers across the country to military installations and all of that. And she flew some pretty big airplanes. I mean, small fighters, but also, P-38s. That was a twin engine fighter, all the way up to the B-29, which is a huge airplane. And of course, the B-29 is what delivered the atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And here she's this little woman. What did you say? She was about 5'6" or something like that?
5'6", and a big aircraft. B-52 wasn't going to bother her one bit. So nor was a general. So I suspect if we did a little more research into the history of the WASP, we'd probably find her name prominent somewhere, and maybe even having words with somebody or telling him what to do, because she certainly had her definite ideas and was not afraid to vocalize them.
Well, part of it was probably the fact that she really wasn't in the military. I was reading in your draft that the WASP were really civil servants. They were employees of the federal government.
Right.
So I guess a general didn't have quite the
effect on him. She could do what she wanted, really.
Yeah, for sure. But also during that time, during World War II, she was training future fighter pilots in aerobatics. She was an excellent aerobatics pilot and instructor.
I think that's what she liked to do. And that's why she would take these young teenagers up in the sky and let me show you how to fly, and then turn the plane upside down, and then everyone would be nervous and scared. And as you know, Chuck, more than anybody, if you're not a skilled pilot, you can get very confused in where the top and where the bottom is, right? Whether you're going up or down. And certainly for somebody that had never flipped around in an aircraft or gone down deep into the bowels of the Grand Canyon, and you're looking at a cliff straight ahead of you, I wonder how you're going to lift out of there. So she, that little daredevil part of her, always stayed with her, always, all the way to the end.
Yeah. Well, as a helicopter pilot, I didn't particularly like unusual attitudes. We never flew upside down in a helicopter. I just was very uncomfortable. It's disconcerting.
Absolutely.
For sure. But she was fearless, and that was her natural element. So the war ends, and I don't know if she had purchased the property. She and her husband, Joe, had purchased that acreage there between Tippecanoe and Waterman Avenue, and just north of the I-10 freeway. So then they opened up the airport. She had her airline going. And based on what you've told us so far, she flew a lot. Like you said, 4 trips to LAX per day. And in addition to that, flying many different people, celebrities, and you said mobsters, but they all respected her, right?
After respected her, she was a leading figure, the head of the postmaster general in the country after World War II. She's developing a bit of a reputation. Does a stunt where they're promoting airmail, and they have the cameras out and do a newsreel with Pinky landing on Redlands Boulevard, and then opening up the airplane, all this mail falling out. But since this is, I remember the Inland Empire, an interesting little nuance to the acquisition of the airport is that it used to be on the southern part of the I-10 as well, and the I-10 was not purchased when the airport was there. So the first time that Pinky came into a little bit of money in order to develop the airport was when Caltrans condemned the part of the I-10 that goes from Waterman to Tippecanoe. They condemned it to build the freeway, and they took quite a bit, because they took the north and the south lanes. And Pinky, her foundation to this day, still owns property on the south side of the I-10 where there are shrewd little businesswoman Pinky. She put 2 billboards up that are still there today, and are operated by a national billboard company. But my point is, she did have the property that went all the way to Redlands Boulevard in the late 40s.
Wow.
And then later on, Chuck, they started to develop Loma Linda University Medical Center, which was a much smaller affair back in the 30s and 40s, and operated under a different name of Evangelist. And Pinky opened up the airport, started to develop it, built a little waiting room there, and in part of the process, she built a little stand like you'd see in an airport or a courthouse, where you have the hot dogs that roll around in the machine. You'd have coffee and candies and that sort of thing. So she thought her natural business to keep her going on a day-to-day basis would be the employees at Loma Linda. And so she had veggie dogs and post them, and things that were she thought were going to be popular, things that they marketed at the coffee shop at the hospital. And she found that her place was a place where people that didn't want to have, that needed a real jolt of real coffee, or they wanted a real hot dog, wanted to go. So she had to toss out all those munitions and switch her fare to something that was not quite the same as you got in the hospital. She was quite proud of that too.
So she had a rebellious nature.
By her nature, she was very much rebellious and very much a forger. There's another great story of Pinky. She did do the mobsters, as you say, and we did have, back in those days, there was a cast of characters that Bugsy Siegel had an outfit in Lake Arrowhead, and in Waterman Canyon there was gaming going on, and gambling going on, a pretty good operation in Waterman Canyon. And so she would ferry these people here and take care of them. But one of the great stories that a physician told me, Finus Wiggins, they called him Pete, and Pete was an OB doctor who claimed to have delivered 10,000 babies, which he probably did. And one weekend, Pete and his good friend Martin Matich, who was a large iconic figure in our area as well, were going to go to Las Vegas. But Pete was on call. In those days, you had beepers and didn't have anyone to take over from him. So Pinky flew Martin and Pete up to Las Vegas, where she kept a small Falcon truck. Do you remember the Ford Falcon automobile with a flatbed? Pinky, by the way, had a collection of cars. She had a first DeLorean. She had the Falcon truck. She had a fleet that she would keep in Las Vegas, because not only would she get out of the aircraft and usher her guest out of the plane, she'd put them in the car and drive them to the casino. So, and I think the airport, again, in the 40s, 50s, airport was probably pretty modest in Las Vegas as well. And so Pinky dropped them off at the casino, and Pete Wiggins got a page that a woman was in her last stages and she was going to deliver. And Pete and Martin were at the crap table, and Pete said, "I got to go." So he calls Pinky. She picks him up. She flies him down. He goes to the hospital. I don't know whether it was community hospital or St. Bernardine. Goes to the hospital, delivers the baby, goes back to the airport. Pinky's waiting for him. She flies him back up to Las Vegas. Great story. That's a great story in itself. But the better part of the story is when Pete went into the casino, Martin Matich was at the same crap table that he was before he left.
Just to resume things. I understand that the airport, I landed there one time before I was a pilot. I was a passenger, and I don't remember much about it, but apparently the airstrip was dirt. It was a dirt strip.
Right. I think it always was dirt. I'm not sure there was ever any asphalt. I don't think there was.
Well, there was a part in your book draft that said that was by design, because she already felt that she paid too much in property taxes. And if she would have improved the runway and paved it, it would be even more expensive for the taxes.
You fought that assessor every year. There's no question.
Well,
and it worked for it. And I think you're a helicopter pilot. I think there was a LA Airways or some kind of helicopter service between her place and LAX that operated in the late 60s, perhaps.
Yes, that's correct. And we're actually going to do something. We're going to feature that story in a later episode of I Remember the Inland Empire.
Good.
Because that's part of the history of the Inland Empire.
Right.
There's a story that there was a Navy C-130 transport plane that was coming in from Hawaii and was destined for Norton Air Force Base. And it was pretty low on fuel. And apparently that particular night, they were doing maintenance on the runway at Norton Air Force Base. So the runway lights were off. And so the pilot, again, was facing a low fuel situation. So he landed at Tri-City Airport, this Navy military transport. So what do you know about that?
All I know is that Pinky never forgot it. She was madder than a hatter when it happened. She was in a constant battle with whoever the commander was at Norton Air Force Base at the time, was always in her mess kit and hers. And she went out there in the middle of the night and, cursed and screamed and then called the commander at the base. And, I don't care who you're not to use my airport. You're trying to take over my runway. Now you're landing your airplanes without consent. You're going to cause damage. I run this place. And don't you ever land an aircraft here again without my permission. And she never forgot the story and told it the rest of her life. I was quite proud of it too. I guess she should have been. Again, she learned how to be what she had to do to run an airport in what was then a man's world.
There were quite a few quotes from Pinky in the book draft, and I quickly became aware of the fact that she was really a very intelligent person,
right, and
a very eloquent person in her speech and writings.
And as tough as she was, Chuck, as I said earlier in the show, she was very sophisticated, and she could walk into a room like she's the queen, or she could go take care of the mechanic out on the airstrip.
Well, if I could just again quote a little bit from your book draft, a couple of things where she was quite eloquent. One of those is she spoke highly of the courageous astronauts who enjoyed similar fame and adulation by another generation, but reminded her audience there is something quite different between their exploits as part of an international network of technology and communications and the daring deeds of those earlier flyers who sometimes faced the unknown with little more than a wing and a prayer. They were our white knights, our trailblazers, our Luke Skywalkers, and how I wanted to be one of them. And then another time, and I've experienced this too as a helicopter pilot flying in the early morning. And she says, when you are airborne just before dawn, and suddenly there gleams off to the east the first pale silver promise of another day, no one need say anything, Pinky said once. The stillness speaks with its own eloquence. I mean, that sounds like a very sophisticated woman.
Well, she's sophisticated. She also knows she's playing to her audience. So whether she got a little bit of help in putting some of those eloquent words together, I don't know. I think I've got to give her credit for them because it came from her own writings and her own text. But the whole family was very accomplished. And I think that the truth of the matter is, like some siblings in some families, each one wanted to outdo the other at all times. And so if Pinky was going to make an address, she was going to make sure she put a lot of work into it so that she could distribute it, so that her siblings could see it, so that she could, we didn't have the internet in those days, but she ran later on in her later years, she ran her office out of her house on what used to be the airport. And she had an office downstairs with desks and secretaries, and her apartment was upstairs. It was like a little Manhattan apartment, and it was a very sophisticated operation. Matter of fact, Chuck, someday I think you may want to do a little story on her home, which has been converted to a law office by my friend Bill Shapiro, who has a collection of antique cars. Like I said, she had a DeLorean and Falcon and BMW, and she had a variety of vehicles herself. He uses her warehouse for displaying his vehicles to this day, and he has his law office downstairs and an apartment upstairs. It's kind of a unique tribute to Pinky, who was articulate, who was sophisticated, and in her retirement years, when she sold so much of the airport property, she retained this piece of property for her house, and had her nephew, who was an architect, design it. And it's a great piece of architecture. It is very much Pinky. And just to show you how forward thinking and intelligent she was, she had property next door to this house that she built on the former airstrip. And she gave it to the Highway Patrol to build their regional offices. She thought that was a good idea because she would have the Highway Patrol and law enforcement right next door to her, and protecting her fiefdom.
So she retired from flying finally at age 80.
Age 80, she had a little mishap on Waterman Avenue, only one she ever had, and didn't hurt herself. Kind of did a little damage to the left wing of the aircraft, but she decided it was time to hang him up. And I think Joe might have been gone by that time, and she didn't have him to repair things and to make sure things were just right. So she very wisely decided it was time.
So this area that we're speaking about between Tippecanoe and Waterman Avenue and just north of the I-10, and Hospitality Lane goes right through there, right?
Oh, it is Hospitality Lane. I mean, if you're, and this is, I remember the Inland Empire, so people, I'm sure, to this day still drive through there when they come to their hometown to visit. This is where you will now see banks and restaurants and county offices. Wells Fargo has a big building in there. The credit union has a big building. The county has several buildings. The Outback Restaurant, the Costco. I mean, it goes on and on. It is the major commercial area of the city of San Bernardino, and that is all Pinky's Airport. It's a big piece of property, 135 acres, I think. But yeah, no, but she, again, you talk about being articulate, being wise. She didn't sell all the land. She maintained some key parcels, like the interchange of Waterman and Hospitality, which is one of you by valuing property and building a fast food. They measure you by traffic counts, and Waterman and Hospitality is one of the highest traffic counts in Southern California. She retained that property, and we sold a piece of it to a buffet outfit, which is on the freeway. And today, if you drive by, there's a Taco Bell going up on her property. There's still a couple more lots. And then her house was on Brier Drive. Of course, she didn't have any ego, right? The street was named after her. And so Brier Drive goes through where her house is. And she had another lot next door to the Highway Patrol, where they're just building a motel right now. So she saved some key parcels in that whole airport for development 10 years, 15 years after she's left us. Quite a visionary.
Well, that's what I was thinking as you were saying that, is she obviously could look ahead and see that
Right.
things were going to be even more valuable.
Right.
And she would be able to sell those parcels for even more money just to sit on them. So that's great.
Well, she also was going to fight the system a little bit. She wasn't going to sell that property and pay all that capital gains tax. She's going to hold on to some of it, so the assessor wouldn't get all of it. So yeah, she was, although, as I say, very, very liberal with her trips to Washington and with her designer clothing and with buying 4 aircrafts. She didn't want to give the government. She, I don't think the government wasn't the enemy, but just like she took on the commander at the base and took on the men's world, she took on the assessor on a regular basis over property taxes, like you said earlier.
Well, it sounds like she wanted to pay a fair amount, but not more than her fair share, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. No, she paid plenty. She had employees, and she was buying a lot of fuel, paid a lot of tax on that. She paid her fair share, no question.
Yeah. So how old was she when she passed away, and what year was that?
I think it was about 2004. I should have looked that up for you, and I think she was 96. So that's more or less what it was. And she was pretty healthy up to the last year of her life. She talk about her being shrewd. She also, Mike Cole, who is my collaborator on the book, for 25 years or 30 years, has sold pumpkins and fireworks and Christmas trees on the corner of Waterman and Hospitality. And Pinky, for many years, was the biggest promoter of those because she could get a nice little Christmas check for those Christmas trees, and she get a little check in the summertime for the fireworks and a little something at Halloween. Another cute little vignette is competing with her sister Jean for the attention of the rich and famous. There was a old time, I think, Alabama senator named Strom Thurmond, who perhaps was in the Senate till he was almost 100, I think. Maybe one of the longest serving, and he was a great friend of Jean Dixon. And Pinky would go down to that Christmas tree lot every year when they got the trees in, and make Mike package up a tree and send it to Strom Thurmond's Senate office in the Dirksen building in Washington. Compliments and love from Pinky Brier, so that Strom would have to tell Jean Dixon that I got this Christmas tree from your sister in California.
Well, as we conclude our discussion, is there anything else that we should talk about with regard to the amazing Pinky Brier?
Yeah, I think there's one thing that's going to be important for those who may tune in to I Remember the Inland Empire. Pinky didn't leave us with any children. She gave some very nice gifts to her nieces and nephews with whom she was close, and she did something very nice for USC for a football program in honor of her brother, and she did something for Mayo Clinic. So she was very generous. But whatever was left over, she wanted to help educate women and help cut women in the same mold that Pinky was. It's one of the reasons why Mike and I wrote the book, so that as scholarships and assistance are given to young women in the future with an interest in aviation, they have a book and they have a story of Pinky, like you're helping create here on I Remember the Inland Empire. And so there, when we finish with these properties and kind of wrap up Pinky's earthly affairs here, there will be some money in a Pinky and Joe Brier Foundation. It will be hopefully used primarily for young women who want to challenge the system and want to find their place in the world. If they want to have some kind of career in aviation, it's all the better, and that would please her. So I'm hoping that we'll finish our book, and we're hoping we'll give you a copy and be able to use it for educational purposes, not only for historical purposes, but to motivate young women. And hopefully Pinky's gift to them at the end will be helping them with their formal education and maybe getting them in the air as well. That's great.
Well, Bill, this has been a very interesting discussion about a truly amazing person, a pioneer, a force of nature,
Absolutely. And the force is going to go on for a long time. So we'll finish off the book and share it with you. And then perhaps in future days, we can work on young women in the Inland Empire to let them kind of carry on the force of nature that Pinky set in place.
All right. Well, Bill, thanks so much for sharing your memories about this amazing person, Pinky Brier. And we look forward to having your book come out, because what I've read is it's very interesting. She was truly an amazing person.
Okay. Well, thanks for giving her the attention she deserves. We appreciate it, John. Mike.
That concludes this episode of I Remember the Inland Empire. Thank you for joining us. Today's program was produced and edited by Mike Coonard. And by the way, subscribe to our channel. We would appreciate it very much. Until next time, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Mike.